Hello, everyone, and welcome to the SANS Threat Analysis Rundown live stream this month. Hope you are having an awesome day so far. Thanks so much for joining us. My name is Katie Nichols. I'm a SANS certified instructor for Forensics 578, also Director of Intelligence at Red Canary, and a non-resident fellow at the Atlantic Council. And I'm so excited to be joined today by my friend Adam Pennington, who is the MITRE ATT&CK lead. And in all transparency, we used to work together. We still chat about all the threat things. Really excited to have Adam join us today. And we do different things on this live stream. And today, Adam's going to kind of deep dive into a new ontology type, I don't know the right word for this, of campaigns that they're going to be adding to MITRE ATT&CK. And also talking about why that matters and why it's important for analysts and defenders, and give some additional clarity on tracking all of the mess of threat groups that are out there. So Adam, welcome. Thanks so much for joining us this month.
Welcome. Yeah, thank you so much for having me on.
A little bit of background on how we got here. I feel like we should tell them, Adam. So Adam and I were actually supposed to be in London last week. But then, as we all know, Her Majesty passed away. Like, really tough to hold an event in London. And so figured, well, this is something that's pretty time sensitive. So Adam agreed to come and talk to you all today rather than presenting in London. So I'm sorry, I'm not drinking tea, just water, but we'll pretend we're in London right now.
Well, so it's not London, but it is great to be here. And yeah, thank you so much for inviting me.
Of course.
Let me kick up my screen.
We can see it. Go for it.
So as Katie said, I'm Adam Pennington. I lead MITRE ATT&CK. And yeah, I was hoping to come today and talk a little bit about some of the issues that we've seen in tracking threat groups over really long periods of time. Some issues that might be familiar in your own practice, and some of the work that we're getting ready to release in ATT&CK that we think might help us do it a bit better. And again, maybe something you can bring to your own space. So just a little bit about the journey I'm planning to take here. I wanted to get into a bit about how threat groups are created. So I'm guessing people have an idea of what a threat group is, but some of the issues that we're running into come from how they're created and maintained over long periods of time. Some of what adversary change looks like. So some of the things that come in when you're doing this really long duration tracking, and some of the problems that creates. Now, I'm mostly going to be touching on APT groups today. I know that isn't necessarily in some of Katie's theme, but I do want to talk about how some of that applies to ransomware as well. And finally, I want to bring in a pretty familiar concept in cyber threat intelligence that we're leveraging in ATT&CK to try to improve on some of these issues. So how does a threat group get built? Well, generally, it all starts with an incident. So an incident response firm, a victim, some organization sees an intrusion, is able to piece it together and gather intelligence on it. And so maybe an organization has visibility into multiple incidents. They see the same set of actions happening at another organization. Over time, maybe they're able to collect a number of those incidents together that have different things in common. And maybe we're even able to build a cluster on that. So I'm not going to get deep into the how do you cluster these. There are a lot of ways to do it. Maybe these have multiple things in common between who the adversary is, who the victim is, what infrastructure they're using, and what their capabilities are. But we're able to find that cluster that we create into a threat group. So say we want to publish this out, get it out there. We want to give it a unique name. So we can't just call it, threat group. And our marketing team wants something a bit more interesting than that. So maybe we call it Mauve Ostrich. So we've got a report on Mauve Ostrich out there, and another company comes along, another victim, and sees incidents that seem to be related to this group. And they add it to the picture that's out there of Mauve Ostrich. But naturally, they give it their own name. So something Katie's talked about in the past is how it is natural for organizations to have their own names for the groups they see and their own visibility. And we do the same on ATT&CK. So maybe at this point in time, We add the group to attack. We give an identifier like G0256, and it keeps building over time. Maybe a couple of years later, the first firm sees more incidents related to it. They put out a new report, revisiting Mauve ostrich. And even years later, a decade down the line, we might have new organizations spotting activity that they're able to tie back to this and still adding names to the picture. So all of this is getting added into a single threat group profile over a long period of time. Now, ATT&CK has been tracking this kind of reporting and these kinds of threat group material for a pretty decent period of time now, back to 2014. And so we first released it in public in 2016 under supervision of Katie. And at this point in time, we're now up to tracking 133 different threat groups. And so we've built up a ton of material over that time and a ton of reports where we've definitely seen some patterns. And so something we've seen across a lot of these groups is that adversaries often reuse behavior from incident to incident. This is good if we want to use cyber threat intelligence to be able to watch for our adversaries. And it's one of the ideas behind ATT&CK, that by watching behaviors, we get into a space that is hard for adversaries to change. It's that peak of David Bianco's pyramid of pain. But something else that we've seen is even with small changes from incident to incident, and sometimes really large ones, it can add up to an adversary completely changing over time. So I wanted to give a concrete example of that with a threat group that I suspect a lot of people are at least somewhat familiar with or have heard of. And that's APT29 or Cozy Bear, or as the identifier we'd give it an attack, G0016. This is a group that we've had a ton of reporting on over the years. We have 48 different references, which roughly means that we've used 48 different reports adding up this profile. I talked about those different names that different organizations are giving to it, and we've collected 12 of these different names that seem to be associated with overlapping group profiles. Building all these reports together, we've collected on 142 different attack techniques that this group is using, and that covers every part of enterprise attack, every tactic other than impact. We don't have them getting into really destructive activity. And we've also tracked them using 46 different pieces of software. So I want to get into a little bit about how this group has changed over time, that all this information is combined into a single group profile, but different eras look fairly different for this group. Now, this is some generalizations. You may have seen some specific activity that falls outside of this, but from the open source public threat intelligence that we've added to ATT&CK, these are generally what we've seen from these eras. So in the beginning, this group looked a lot like their peers. They're using spear phishing attachments, sending in malicious emails. They were sticking to enterprise networks. They appeared to be writing a lot of their own malware, so somewhat easy to signature for a specific group. Heavy use of the Windows command shell, what looked like in a lot of cases hands-on keyboard. Trusting of the victim environment, so meaning that their malware was willing to run without really checking for a sandbox or honeypot. And a lot of their command and control traffic was obfuscated or fairly weak encryption, in some cases even in clear text. Now, if you've just come into this space, this may sound pretty bad, but for where defenders were at this era, it was, they were fairly successful in this time period and did look like a lot of their peers. But over time, this group did advance quite a bit. So they still were using a lot of spear phishing attachments, sometimes with entertaining videos to try to get people to click. They were still sticking to enterprise networks, still using some of their own what looked like custom malware, but bringing a lot of commodity tools at this point. They were big fans of Microsoft sysinternals, especially things like delete in their operations. And after years of doing command line use in Windows Command Shell, as defenders finally started to get good at watching Windows command line, these actors shifted into extensive PowerShell use. And not just PowerShell use, but heavily obfuscated PowerShell that they were immediately deleting once they wrote it to disk using delete. After being fairly trusting of the environments they were in, they started doing paranoid hunting for honeypots, using scripts that would do things like score every part of the system for how much it looked like a sandbox. So things like how many files were on the desktop, how long was the file name that they were executed from? Does it look like a hash that was downloaded from VirusTotal? They seriously upped their game on encryption as well, being one of the first groups to move to TLS using ephemeral Diffie-Hellman. So much harder to read traffic. And so the yellow here is behaviors that have changed from the earliest profile that we were watching the group. And this group has kept moving over time. It's activity that was still tied back to APT29. More recently, we've seen get into things like supply chain attacks, extensive use of cloud resources, and a lot of operations now. This group is pivoting from various pieces of cloud that they're using. We've seen them go from tools that can be somewhat signatured and unique to the group to commercial malware that basically everybody is using with Cobalt Strike. As organizations finally started to get good at monitoring PowerShell, this adversary moved a lot into using WMI and in ways that tended to not write files to disk, so leaving very little for forensic response. They've continued their trend of paranoid hunting for honeypots, and they've kept up using good encryption. And so with what I've talked about how we form groups, we've naturally combined all of this information together in our picture that we look at an attack, and we suspect the way a lot of other people would look at them too. But what that leaves us with is that we now have a group profile where we're saying that APT29 does spear phishing attachments to get into a network at the same time that they're doing supply chain attacks. That they're sticking to just enterprise networks. At the same time, we're saying that they're making extensive use of cloud resources. We're talking about them using their own custom tools at the same time as we're saying they're using commercial malware, commodity tools. We're saying that they're using Windows Command Shell. At the same time, we're saying that they're using PowerShell. At the same time, we're saying they're using WMI. That they're both leaving artifacts behind on disk and using fileless techniques. That they're trusting of victim environments and paranoid hunting for honeypots, and that their traffic is easily readable and that it's just obfuscated. At the same time, we're saying that it's heavily encrypted. And so these things don't agree with each other. They're conflicting in a lot of these cases. So this big picture and collecting over a really long period of time does have some benefits. So say we want to focus our network defenses on APT29. Well, if we did that and we focused on all of these things, it's a really broad set of behaviors. And so this can give us something that, if you're using attack, is just a fraction of attack, but still gives us a wide range of activity that overlaps with various intrusion sets. It gives us a more complete picture over time. We've got some history here. And maybe we can fill in some intelligence gaps. If, say, we don't know for a given time period how they're doing a particular tactic, but we're pretty sure they're doing it, we might just look at how they've been doing it earlier in time. But there's some problems here too. So with these conflicts, this adversary that's represented here never existed. There is no point in time where there was an APT29, a Cozy Bear, whatever you want to call them, that looked like this set of behaviors. And so if you think about some of the use cases we might want to do for cyber threat intelligence, we can't really use this to emulate the current adversary or any specific past period of time. We've sort of commingled it all. We've lost a lot of fidelity in doing this. So we had these periods of time, but we've sort of lost that. And it can also lead to misguided prioritization. So if we want to prioritize in our defenses on what APT29 looks like today, we don't have that picture anymore.
Adam, I wanted to jump in here because when I saw this slide and the little checks and the X's, I was like, this. And I really just want to foot stomp this for everyone who's listening, because I'm sure you see the discussions on Twitter like I do of like, oh, does it really matter? Right? Like APT 29 in, a few years ago, it's close enough. And, do I have to track these different, years or different TTPs? Like, I think this is a great way for you to think about, like, does it matter for you? Yeah. If you're trying to defend against the TTPs of like the past few months, it really does matter to track these over time. So I just wanted to like jump in and foot stomp that, like, really think carefully about your use case, your intelligence requirements here. I'm curious, Adam, do you feel like for most orgs, like people you talk to, are they more on the like, oh, just combine it all, it doesn't matter? Or on the like, no, you should separate it out so that you have more fidelity?
We think most people are combining it together.
Yeah.
Our data is on what we've been doing ourselves, which is, of course, combining everything. But we think that's somewhat the standard way to do it. And there are, like I said, a lot of use cases where that might be the right thing to do, where you are trying to get this holistic picture. But there are very specific things that people want to do and focus in their intelligence, where you might be hurting yourself, or you might be, if you've got limited resources, spreading them too thinly if you really want to focus in on something specific.
Yeah, I think it's just a great point that a lot of people are combining TTPs over years. And I think it's a great point to say, like, maybe that works, but I'd encourage everyone, like, think about how your team is doing. And does that really make sense for your requirements? Like, rather than that being the default in the community, I think this is a great way to have that discussion of like, should you break it out more granularly over time? So I just wanted to jump in because I really love this slide. So I wanted to make sure everyone else knows how much I love this slide.
Well, and, we still think that it's definitely okay to have it both ways. I'm jumping ahead a little bit, but we're not throwing away the way we're doing things now in attack. We're trying to add some structure, be able to get some of this back rather than completely jump away for it. We're trying to serve sort of both use cases.
Why not both meme insert here?
Exactly. So I'm being a little bit gauche today in current times, focusing on APT groups. I know Katie, and especially this space, been a lot more ransomware recently. But we do see some similar issues with ransomware. Now, we don't have ransomware groups where we've been compiling 14 years of data, like somebody like APT29, but we have other ways that data is being combined that can cause similar problems, and that is ransomware affiliates being combined based on software. This thankfully isn't a practice that we're dealing with ourselves in attack, but we're seeing it fairly commonly in other organizations and in reporting. And it's kind of a sloppy CTI practice. The pivots aren't really there to cluster these affiliates together. And some of the reason for that is how that market works. So where we've got a ransomware as a service operator, the people that are creating the tools and running some of the pieces that are being used in ransomware, where we have completely independent affiliates actually doing the intrusions. And so while they might be getting the same playbook from the ransomware as a service operator, which we've even had the chance to see in a few cases the last couple of years, it's still independent teams that are doing their own behaviors and their own look on the independent systems. And so combining all of these together can give a similar loss of fidelity as combining years. So those are all solid reasons on why this might be not a great way to only do it this way. But that wasn't our actual final straw. And so funny enough, it relates closely to the last time that I joined Katie on the previous version of this webcast. And so early last year, I appeared on Star with Jen Burns to talk about work that ATT&CK had done around the SolarWinds intrusions. Now, I'm guessing most people remember us, and in some cases, maybe twitching a little bit at me even mentioning it. But in late 2020, there was a series of reporting that came out over a bunch of intrusions that happened between places like SolarWinds, FireEye, Microsoft, and a number of end victims. So there was a big flood of reporting. This was seen as some fairly new activity. We were able to identify a bunch of new attack techniques that were occurring with this, new behaviors that we hadn't seen reported before. And so we put a lot of work into compiling the activity we saw. So this group was called UNC 2452 by Mandiant FireEye at the time. And so we did blog posts on the various techniques we were seeing. We put out separate tracking to try to keep track of all the different reporting that was coming out, updating it as much as several times daily. And, that's what we were talking to Katie here about last year. We even put out a out-of-cycle release of ATT&CK where we wanted to get the information out to people as soon as possible talking about this. Well, before we even got the next major version of ATT&CK out, people started reporting, and starting with the federal government, but moving on into later private industry, that, something that a lot of people suspected was probably true, that UNC 2452 was really APT29, that same group that I've been talking about. And so we had built up this profile for UNC 2452, and we had discovered 50 techniques in the various reporting around it that we created. And in the next major version of release, that all got mushed into our APT29 profile. Multiple researchers have come to us since then and asked us, I was really interested in this one group and in the activity they did around that time period. I want to emulate them. And so how do you separate out UNC 2452 and ATT&CK? Well, you can't. And so that was one of the final straws for us in moving to introduce some new structuring. And so where we're going, and where I think a lot of other organizations may be served well by doing as well, is into a familiar CTI concept of campaigns. And so our own definition of campaigns, and this is a term that we're obviously reusing, is a grouping of intrusion activity conducted over a specific period of time with common targets and objectives. This activity may or may not be linked to a specific threat actor. So that's probably not the first time you've ever heard the term campaign before. It's actually even already baked into some security standards as a type of object. But we don't often see it combined with threat group tracking. So there's definitely reporting coming out that might be about a specific campaign, even using that term in the reporting. But we don't see a lot of people keeping that structure in how they're doing it. And so the idea is to do both at once. To break groups back out into clusters of activity that share a relatively short time period. And so days and months, not years. So not even the lengths of time that I was just showing in APT29 eras, and have a common objective. And so something that is not necessarily intuitive is that individual intrusions grouped together into a campaign might not share specific software behaviors and victim country industry role. So SolarWinds, the UNC 2452 campaign, is a great example of what I mean by this. So they broke into cloud providers, they broke into software providers to get into the supply chain. And the software and what they did at those types of organizations looks very different from what they did on the end victims. What you do to get yourself into a build system or get into a cloud environment is not the same as what you're going to do on an end victim, which might have information you want. But I think we'd all agree that activity does cluster into a single campaign. So graphically, the idea is basically to reverse that process that I showed in how we build a threat group. So taking that group and breaking it back out into these clusters of incidents. So if this was APT 29, maybe have one that was campaign C0154 or SolarWinds, which was Microsoft's old name for 2452. Maybe we have groups of incidents that were never given a name, and that's okay. We'll be able to give it a campaign identifier and split it back out, and rinse, wash, repeat. Go through and break out what we can from the threat group. And that might not be everything. And so we're getting ready to introduce the campaign structure to attack in version 12, which is scheduled to come out late next month. So a couple things about our specific implementation of campaigns. Campaigns may or may not be connected to a group. So there's excellent reporting that comes out that sees a cluster of activity. They're never able to connect it back to a broader threat group or something that's seen over a period of time. And that's okay. So we're willing to add campaigns to attack that are standalone, and in fact will be in the initial release as we convert some things that are groups today but are really campaigns. It may or may not have a name. And so that's different than how attack tracks threat groups today. So you may or may not know this, but attack will only add a threat group if some other company has stood up and given it a specific name. And so we won't just add G00 something as a group until somebody's called it out as a threat group and given it a name. Campaigns we will be willing to add as just an identifier where somebody has identified a cluster. It will be tied to a period of time. That's a requirement for us internally, and we will be giving references to where those times are coming from in reporting. And it'll be down to the granularity of months and years. I don't want to give a false perception that we are suddenly about to release a version of attack where we have converted all 133 of those groups into campaigns. We don't have anywhere close to the number of people or the amount of resources that would require. So we will be converting some groups to campaigns in the initial release, and moving forward, we'll be using these in our material. But we're going to be converting existing content as our resources allow. This is an area where we're looking for contributions from the community too, though. So if you have an interest in picking up a specific group and attack, suggesting ways that it might be broken out into campaigns, we're definitely all ears after the release comes out. So I wanted to give the first preview of what a campaign looks like. This, I think, the first time anyone's seen this outside of the attack team. And I can hear Katie now. These fonts are too small. So zooming in on the sections that are actually in here, and the data is not important. This is all fake placeholder data anyway. It's going to have a lot of the fields that you might be familiar with from a group page. So things like associated campaign descriptions. There are campaigns that are written about by multiple organizations. So SolarWinds, UNC 2452, et cetera, is an example where there might be multiple associated campaign descriptions. Optionally, what groups is it tied back to? And of course, we do not have a campaign coming called The Final Frontier tied to Wizard Spider. I just needed to add a group in so that it would show up. What techniques they use. So this is the procedures that go with a given campaign, and similar to a group, what software they're associated with. The metadata will also be very similar to a group. It'll be a C00 number instead of a G00 number, and adding in the first and last seen dates. And the final release version will have references mixed in with that. So just like procedures, just like techniques used on groups, This data will show up in a few different places in attack. So in groups themselves, if there are campaigns associated with it, you'll be able to see those along with a brief version of what techniques actually are associated with the campaign. This is similar to how groups look, or how software looks like now in groups. And it'll also flow down into techniques. So where before we had just software and groups appearing on technique pages for procedures, we'll now have software, groups, and campaigns. So our hope is that this is going to solve some of the issues that we have today with doing these very large combined sets. We believe that where we are able to structure groups back out into campaigns, it can more accurately represent how an adversary looked at a given time. We'll be able to split that UNC 2452 back out again. And this can be really good, especially for the use case of adversary emulation. If we want to look like an adversary today, look like an adversary 5 years ago, we want to emulate something that looked like, the adversary ever realistically did. Lets us keep the fidelity of clusters of incidents. So our data often naturally comes in as campaigns. Reports are writing about a series of incidents together. And this can be a way to actually keep that data intact and be able to reuse it. It can allow us to do that prioritization Katie and I were talking about a little bit earlier, where if we do have a recent campaign, we might be able to use that to look at recent behavior. But we're not doing anything to prevent all of this data from being still seen combined, the way that people are used to visualizing it in attack. It's going to be a little bit different in Sticks Under the Hood, and we're planning on releasing in the next week a blog, making sure people understand what's coming with that. But using it from the website itself, you'll still be able to see it combined, and there's nothing preventing you in your own environment from doing that, where you can still focus on this broad set of behaviors to be able to defend against and get that complete picture of an adversary over time. So my hope that you've taken away from this is that adversaries do change over periods of time and can look completely different if you give them a long enough time period. But that it still can be useful to build up threat groups that are tracking over that very long time period. But there are specific intelligence use cases where our intelligence might be less actionable. And our hope is that by us and maybe you introducing a bit of structure to your threat groups, that you can restore some of the context that's been lost. And that's me. I'm fairly easy to find, as is my team on Twitter and elsewhere.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Adam. One question we had already come in. Can you share the links at the end? So I'm just going to drop, Adam has a slide next with all the links to things that he's talked about. I'll attempt to drop those into a comment. And if you're watching this later, don't quote me on it. I think you can see the comments coming in and grab all the awesome links that we've shared throughout. So if you do have questions for Adam, feel free. You can type those in. I have a couple of questions that I will kind of get us started with. So you touched on your previous slide, Adam, on kind of some of the benefits of structuring with campaigns, like some of the challenges that this solves. I'm curious your thoughts on what challenges still remain with campaigns group naming that this doesn't solve.
Well, it does make things a little bit more complicated to combine the data under the hood. And it's something our own team's even dealing with as we add yet more structure to our sticks. So we are having to make changes under the hood and how this data is represented. And there's no getting around it. This does make parsing some of this data and dealing with it more complicated. It doesn't fix people being sloppy about how they group things. If people are just putting stuff out there saying that somebody else called this APT29, it's roughly related, I'll just call it APT29 too. This doesn't really fix that. Now we might be more apt to now split that out and just give it a C number our own identifier, since we are willing to add nameless stuff if we do agree that it appears to be associated. But it doesn't really solve that problem that we're often faced with, and I think others too, and that we don't really have enough information to see how something's associated with other activity. We also often don't have the dates in reporting. A surprising amount of reporting doesn't actually disclose when it happened. And so we will occasionally see threat reports where we have enough familiarity with other reporting from an actor that we know something being talked about is 3, 4, 5 years old, being reported as if it happened recently. And there's sort of nothing here that fixes that if we aren't able to sort of encourage that to be in reporting. And this is labor intensive. I'm very painfully aware of that because we would love to convert every single group into attack today. I can't afford it.
If you had, many times the people, maybe you would. So a couple things I jotted down, sort of calls to action for anyone listening who puts out reporting. Please include dates and then clarity on why you're calling it what you're calling it. We could rant about group names forever, but yeah, it's really tough if, my team at Red Canary puts out a report on APT 29. That's a name from Mandiant. It'd be really cool if people could include, why are you calling it APT 29? There's probably a good reason, right? And so I think that added transparency and granularity, it sounds like it helps your team, Adam, on the MITRE ATT&CK side. I know it helps my team. It helps everyone else who's using that reporting.
Well, and if there's not enough granularity in the reporting to sort of be able to verify that linkage, it's so important to understand why the decision was made that it was. It lets us look back later as we're adding everything together, and it lets us make a intelligence decision on do we agree and do we combine this ourselves.
Yeah. Another question I had for you was, what are some of the things you're thinking about in whether something should be a campaign or a group? Thinking that, maybe for someone who wants to do this in their own org, like, how do you think about deciding which is which?
So that can get a little tricky too. So in the past, as you're very well aware, what we've done in Attack is just made everything a group. So if somebody does publish a report on a campaign today, they give it a name, we'll just add it to Attack and we'll call it a group that's named something campaign. And so we've done this very flat in the past. And that's actually some of the easiest stuff for us to convert into campaigns. But really a lot of what we think we're going to be looking for going ahead is some of that duration. So are we seeing something that's happening in more than just one cluster of activity? Is it sustained action over a period of time? Or was it just a single cluster of intrusion activity? And that's going to be a little bit tricky for us as a judgment call, because I think in some cases we probably are going to be making things campaigns that other people are maybe calling groups. But I think in a lot of cases, though, it's relatively clear cut, at least where you have a little bit of past perspective, where you can see, did this group ever come up again? And some of the way that Attack deals with intel helps us a little bit with this, and that we're always talking about the past. We do, with a 6-month release cycle, have a little bit of an opportunity to see, was there a lot more reporting on this? Was it just one organization that saw one cluster of incidents once? And so I don't think that's necessarily going to be easy, but it is something where we're going to have to be doing intelligence analysis of what we're seeing.
Yeah, I think there's probably no easy answer, but yeah, I do think, and this is something my team honestly has been thinking about lately, is like, as the TTPs change, you're really trying to detect, defend, and respond to something that's different. And so I do think, I think it's something that everyone should think about. How are you tracking those dates? right? It's really, really tough. And sometimes if you're combining everything, like QBot did this, Iced ID did this, you're like, when? Because, right, I can tell you Iced ID from a year ago looks very different than Iced ID today, as you kind of talked about with groups. So groups, malware, et cetera. So I encourage everyone to think about, how do you track time for TTPs and then changes, and realizing that I think there's no perfect solution, right? You sort of have to choose something and then like just go with it. So
Well, honestly, how to deal with the dates has been one of the biggest debates internally for us. Yeah, it's been something that we obviously have seen some different ways to do it. What level of granularity do we get down to the specific day? And most recently making sure that we're actually doing references for it, because we want people to be able to look at. So if we're claiming that a particular campaign went from January to March of 2022, where are we getting that from? And so it's a type of metadata that we don't normally have references for in attack. And so just making sure that we're getting ready, showing all of our work. But there's been, it's not even straightforward for us, but we've come to our middle ground that we're getting ready to release.
yeah, and something also foot stomped that a lot of people think that the attack team has like magical sources. Like Adam, I think it's still the case that you all rely a lot on community contributions. So as you said, if people aren't putting it out there publicly, you can't really cite the campaign or group. Is that still the case?
Yeah, our rules are the same as how you wrote them. That we will only accept any information, especially into groups and software, that is from publicly available, and campaigns, excuse me, I have to get used to saying that is coming from publicly available open source threat intelligence reporting. It's a space where we want to be extremely clear on where the data is coming from, where our claims are being made from. And so if the claim is being made in a place that we can't cite the work, and then it will not go into attack, we're willing to take a pretty wide variety of things. It doesn't need to be a glossy PDF coming out that's got big pictures and cartoons drawn by the marketing department for the new campaign. It can be even just a long Twitter thread, but it's got to get out there. If you're telling it to us behind the scenes, that's interesting. I mean, we find that really interesting too, but it won't find its way into attack that way.
Cool. So sharing is caring. Share your stuff publicly. Good message there. So I knew we were going to get some comments on group naming stuff. So I'll screen share. Got a comment coming in. I'll kind of take this one, but you're welcome to chime in, Adam, if you want. Any comments about Unit 42's group renaming? So for those not familiar, I think I hit this on a previous live stream. Unit 42, really a smart team out of Palo Alto. They traditionally have taken the approach with group names, as this blog post explains from Ryan Olson. Right, pretty simple policy. If there's a common name out there, they use that name. So, right, Sophacy, people are calling something Sophacy, Unit 42 would use that name. If there was no common name, they would create a new one. Cool. And I think Adam and I talked about this already, like, please reference others, right? Include known aliases, overlaps, ideally explain those overlaps. So that was their policy for a while. And I think this blog post is great about explaining why Unit 42 made the change they did, right? As they've grown and they have a bunch of new groups they're tracking, right? Ryan explains that this policy hasn't really worked very well, right? It's not that simple. Sometimes they don't always know what someone else has defined as Sophacy, right? There's a risk in using someone else's name. So Ryan explains, here are the names that now Unit 42 is using for their groups, right? For ransomware, they use Scorpius. I think it's constellation types. So my opinion on this, any comments? I think it's great. I think it's great because it meets their use case, right? I know some folks get a little upset because, well, now there's another set of group names to track. I hear you. It's not the most fun. And it is some more work, right? But don't worry, the team at Attack will track all this for you and put it as an associated name. I'm sure they're all over that. But I think it is important because it lets Unit 42 have control over what they're defining how. So those are my thoughts. I think, there's no one right way. I think Adam's message earlier about, right, should you track groups and campaigns over time or groups over time or focus on a specific time period depends on your approach and what works for you. So different strokes for different folks. Folks at Unit 42 do a great job. So I totally respect their decision.
I was thrilled to see this. It's where people are reusing other people's names. Just like Katie and I were saying earlier, digging back into the why, if it's not clearly stated, can be really hard. And so I don't want to memorize another organization's naming scheme. I've already got the animals, all the APTs mixed together by numbers, and our
You
own
got birds. I'm
groups.
sorry.
Yeah, Mauve ostrich. But but even more, the clearly stating how they plan on doing that is something I wish more organizations would be. So there are even organizations that seem to have a fairly clear naming scheme that have never published what it is. And so just even having it out there, what the standards are, how to actually interpret the names. I love organizations doing something like this. And yeah, especially for attack where we depend on intelligence from everyone else. We're not creating our own reports. Clearly understanding how these groups relate to each other. And another trend I love that some people have been doing recently is the Venn diagrams of how different organizations. Am I still in your
I've got it up. I'm going to talk
okay.
about Iran next. So,
and this is exactly the tweet I was thinking of, where Josh has taken all of these different groups that either partially overlap, completely overlap, and this even specifically is a group that's been a challenge for us to untangle the reporting on that was in attack. We've I think done 2 cycles now of trying to separate this out, figure out which clusters we should be keeping together in attack. And this is beautiful. I wish more people were talking about how both their own names and trying to decode how each other's names actually tie together like this.
I reference this diagram more often than I would prefer to admit. So yes, thank you to Josh, awesome analyst over at Proofpoint, who created this, and I sometimes poke him to update it with new names as well. So,
and I've seen at least one more of these recently, and so I think from Mandiant, and I'm just really hoping that this turns into a trend.
Yep. And even if there's no picture, just explaining, like, are there TTP overlaps? Why are you using the name Nemesis Kitten or vice versa, et cetera? So
Mandiant had a recent report where they at least got into the verbal. This partially overlaps with this. This is over here off to the side, but connects this way. Any attempt is better than just, will you reuse someone else's name?
That's a good takeaway. It's not going to be perfect. This work is hard, but making an attempt to be transparent about what you know, how you know it, what the overlaps are. I think that's a good takeaway. Excellent. Well, if you have any final questions for Adam, please drop those in. Otherwise, Adam, thank you so much for joining us today. Really appreciate it, and all of your thoughts. And we all look forward to seeing campaigns roll out very soon. So thanks so much for joining.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. Again, it's not London, but it is great to be here with you today.
Yes.
And have a nice afternoon.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Adam. Well, this is a great transition. I swear I didn't even tell Adam to mention the Venn diagram. That was our sort of main summary for today, but I did want to hit on a couple things that I think are probably worth paying attention to from recent cyber threat reporting. First area I'm going to talk a little bit about, and I will drop some links in on all of these things so you can follow along at home if you would like to. Iran. There has been a lot of reporting and indictments and activity around Iran lately. And so I think this is one that is worth looking at for a lot of different threat models, a lot of different organizations. So this Venn diagram is a good place to start with this, right? A lot of Iran reports have come out over the last month or so, right, in response to the activity in Albania, right? Some actions against the Iran government. Then there's been a report from Mandiant on APT42. And then there was a report from Microsoft on Dev0270. So one nice thing about this Venn diagram is it kind of helps you get acclimated, right? APT42 is a little bit distinct from Dev0270. Why does that matter? Well, they tend to target different types of organizations, right? Important to remember that Iran is an entire country with lots of different adversaries. There's the IRGC, MOIS with different motivations. There are adversaries that maybe work for the government during the day and then moonlight for their own financial gain, right? It's not as simple as just saying Iranian actors. So, highlighting a couple of recent Iran reports that have come out. This was one last week. We saw what I refer to as a whole of government action, right? We've seen a couple of these over the past couple of years from the US government, where the Department of Justice comes out with an indictment, right? In this case, charging 3 Iranian nationals for some ransomware style extortion against critical infrastructure. So that's sort of our first pillar, the legal action, the indictment. Second pillar, kind of the cyber defense angle, right? A report came out from NSA that was co-authored with CISA, FBI, ACSC, Australia, UK, other organizations as well. That had a bunch of takeaways for defenders, right, about TTPs. And then the third pillar, economic, right? I won't go off into international relations world too much, but right, a lot of instruments of power countries can use to try to deter behavior or encourage behavior. In this case, the Department of Treasury out of the US issued sanctions against certain individuals affiliated with this activity. So we got our indictment, right? And I've talked about indictments before, really good reading, a lot of details about, right, how the US Department of Justice and US government is tracking this activity. Sometimes they're useful TTPs. Also worth reading that report from NSA, CISA, and others, right? This is where if you're a defender, an analyst, you might find a lot of value here. And we just had Adam on from the MITRE ATT&CK team. Increasingly, US government has put out reporting, and other governments as well mapped to MITRE ATT&CK. So kind of nice, organized by resource development, right? That before the boom activity, initial access, a lot of detailed indicators of compromise here about web shells, right? That were dropped as a result of proxy shell, that vulnerability that maybe we've forgotten about. Yeah, adversaries are still exploiting that. So a lot of really actionable details in this document from CISA, FBI, NCSC, and others, that joint advisory. I will note that these all this was not the first time these TTPs have been shared publicly, right? Just kind of a compilation. And it's important whenever you see this to think about how, right, this is part of that larger grouping of actions from the US government, right? So they want to help out cyber defenders with things like use multi-factor authentication, but also a larger strategic purpose. So worth checking out that triumvirate of whole of government actions. Other pieces I dropped links into. Highly recommend checking out this Microsoft blog post on Dev0270, which, as they say, is sort of like a subcluster of phosphorus. I'll go back to Josh's awesome Venn diagram there. This is another example of great actionable intelligence. And this one's really important because, right, unlike maybe espionage motivated actors out of Iran, right, Dev0270, sort of a broader targeting, right? So slightly different targets and different organizations, maybe a broader set of organizations that might be worried about Dev0270. So great report from Microsoft. As always, their graphics are pretty awesome. And I've called this out before, but highly recommend scrolling down to the bottom of any Microsoft blog. They have all of these details about queries that are often in KQL language specific to Microsoft, but you can adapt these for whatever log sources you're using. You don't have to be a Microsoft customer to benefit from their knowledge here. Last Iran thing I'll mention, Separately, right, going back to that Venn diagram, APT42, another Iranian group. Mandian put out a great blog post on APT42. Again, maybe you're in a slightly different group of targets to care about this one, but another good practice. You'll see they call out very excellent practice that Adam and I talked about. Hey, APT42 partially coincides with reporting on these other names linking to those groups. I'd love to see it. So definitely take a chance, read those Iranian reports when you have a moment. All right, moving on to the big news breaking the end of last week, I think it was. It seems like so long ago. Yes, Uber got compromised. And yes, it looks pretty nasty. If you know anyone at Uber, please send them food and hugs because they're having a rough time, I'm sure. I would highly recommend. There's a lot going out there in social media. There's a lot of reporting of various levels of reliability. So Uber security update is probably a good place to start for information they've verified. The other thing I would just say is think twice before you retweet or share out any screenshots of compromised information. There's definitely screenshots out there, but think about how you'd feel if your org had screenshots and someone shared them. Kind of rough. It's very easy. As I said, I talked about the Cisco compromise previously. It's very easy from the cheap seats of the people not responding to this compromise to be like, oh, how did this possibly happen? Well, one useful thing you can do is think about what happened. What has Uber shared? What have reliable sources shared about what happened here? So, right, this happened with a lot of other compromises lately. Initial access, the adversary tried to log in and, right, they did this multi-factor authentication fatigue technique. Eventually, the victim accepted one of those, right? Imagine middle of the night or something, you get a whole bunch of, MFA prompts on your phone. You're like, whatever, I just want to go back to sleep. Accept. Just talked about MITRE ATT&CK. Talk to Adam. Well, good news is there is an attack technique already for this, right? Multi-factor authentication request generation. This is a technique we've seen from groups like APT29, which we talked about today. Something that I think a lot of people sometimes overlook on the MITRE ATT&CK pages, there are suggestions about mitigations and detections for all of the many attack techniques that exist, right? So multi-factor authentication. I think the baseline has become use MFA, but as we're seeing from this and other compromises, that's not enough. You have to think about how to implement that in maybe a more resilient way. Someone that I've looked to, an expert on social engineering, all things social engineering, is Rachel Toback. And she's had some really great Twitter threads lately on what are the actions you should be thinking about taking, right? How do you reduce the risk of this MFA overwhelming technique, right? So things like alerting if there's a large volume of MFA pushes, or you're going to hear a lot about FIDO, different protocols, a little more secure. I also dropped a link in thanks to Mark, who highlighted this really good video that breaks down FIDO 2, what it is. If you're like, why is everyone talking about FIDO? That would be a really good watch for you. So think about what you can do in response to if your organization was affected by a similar compromise attempt. How would you be able to mitigate or respond, right? Because now we've seen these similar TTPs used in a lot of high-profile compromises. I'll also call out a link I made to a tweet from Sean Metcalf, expert on a lot of things, including Active Directory. So this is a specific way if you are using Office 365, you might be able to try to detect this type of activity and set those settings in Microsoft Authenticator. So throughout all of this, my recommendation is look for the people who are authoritative, who are credible, folks like Rachel, folks like Sean and Mark, right? Look to the recommendations and really, this is not a time to throw stones. Like Uber knows it really sucks. Like they're in the thick of it, I'm sure. Think about how would you respond if something similar happened to your organization. So those are my 5 cents on the Uber happenings. As we start to wrap up here, the hour flies by. I wanted to mention something that a a lot of people have sort of overlooked. I mentioned that I spend a little bit of time um, talking to the Atlantic Council, folks who make policy. And I'll drop a link into this. This is a request for comment from CISA, right? You might have been familiar if you follow cyber policies, right? The Cyber Incident Reporting for Critical Infrastructure Act has been passed. But what CISA now has to do is figure out how to implement that, right? That policy kind of has the high level, here's what you should do, but CISA has to make regulations around this. And the cool thing is that they're asking for feedback from the community. They're also holding various listening sessions. If you follow Jen Easterly on Twitter, she's talking about those listening sessions where they want feedback from organizations, from incident responders and defenders on what are the guidelines CISA should implement on how critical infrastructure orgs should report incidents, right? How do you define an incident? What should the time threshold be, right? All of those details. How should that reporting happen? And I think this is really important because a lot of you listening probably have a lot of smart ideas on how to do this. And right, I think it's good anytime someone asks for feedback, not a bad idea to spend some time if you're passionate about this subject to give them that feedback. So wanted to highlight that as we kind of start to wrap up for today. One last note, our webpage isn't up, but the SANS Cyber Threat Intelligence Summit in late January, one of my favorite events of the year. Keep an eye out because we'll be sharing more details soon. The call for proposals will be out for talks. So if you have something to say about cyber threat intelligence, start thinking of your ideas because that CFP will be open soon for all of your thoughts and things you want to share with the community. With that, I kept you 3 minutes over. Thanks so much for joining our SANS Threat Analysis Rundown live stream today. Thank you to Adam Pennington, who joined us earlier. Stay well, and we hope to see you in a future month of the live stream. Take care.